Immediately after our program tonight, TVO will bring you the North American premiere of the documentary Judgment in Hungary, an examination of the continuing intolerance and sometimes fatal attacks faced by the Roma in Europe. To set the stage for the documentary, we're turning our attention to the changing political tone in Europe and the rise of nationalist and anti-immigrant parties across the continent. Joining us now for that, in Austin, Texas via Skype, Terry Givens. She's professor in the government department at the University of Texas at Austin. In Athens, Georgia via Skype, Cass Müde, assistant professor in the School for Public and International Policy at the University of Georgia. And with us here in our studios, Randall Hansen, director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the U of T, and Doug Saunders, international affairs columnist at the Globe and Mail. And we're happy to have you two here in our studio and our two guests online from the United States with us for this discussion, which I'm going to set up by reading an excerpt from a piece here from Geocurrents magazine, this by James Mayfield from last year. Here we go, Sheldon, if you would. The last 3 decades have witnessed a remarkable rise in xenophobic, deeply conservative, and even extreme right-wing parties across much of Europe. Whereas 30 years ago, most xenophobic parties failed to pass even the 5% minimum voter threshold that is typically required to enter government, it can be argued that they now constitute as much as 28% of the parliament in countries such as Austria, and arguably have reached the 70% level in Hungary. By 1999, the Austrians, who traditionally tout themselves as the, quote, first victims of the Third Reich, had elected the prominent nationalist and accused Holocaust denier Jörg Haider as the governor of Carinthia and given his Freedom Party more than 26% of the vote in national elections. The Golden Dawn Party, which now has more than 7% of the national vote in Greece, often marches in the streets of Athens with rune-emblazoned flags and jackboots that easily remind the older generations of the German occupation of 1941 to 45. Most recently, the Golden Dawn has distributed free meals to the racially, quote, authentic Greek public. At the same time, prominent members of Hungary's powerful Jobbik party have even called for the government to prepare lists of Jews who might pose a threat to Hungarian national security. All right, that's the setup. Terry, I wonder if I could start with you and just get your take on how widespread you believe the support for these far-right parties is at the moment.
Well, we see the rise of far-right parties across Europe, and that includes the National Front in France. Some have done well in places like the Netherlands, where you have Geert Wilders. You have the Republikaner and the NPD in Germany, which have not done so well. So there's varying levels of electoral support for these parties, but there are several underlying factors that are similar across these countries, which include major social changes which have happened in the last 30 years.
Cass Müde, how would you answer that?
Like Terry, I would say that there are important differences among countries, and I think it also depends a lot on your definition. A term like deeply conservative can be explained in different ways, and so when I look at the numbers, I think a 28% average in Europe of what I would consider far-right parties is a huge exaggeration. I think it is much closer to 10 to 15 at best. But if you start to include parties like Fidesz, as the author clearly does when he speaks about 70% in Hungary, then you open it up much broader, but then you would also include parties that come very close to, for example, Harper's Conservative Party or the GOP here in the US, which I think most of us will not consider as part of the far right.
Randall Hansen, how do you think the state of the far right or / deeply conservative movement in Europe is at the moment?
Well, I'd agree with all of that we need differentiation. In a place like Germany, for example, it's basically in free fall or been very weak for a very long time, 1%, the National Democratic Party in the European elections. What I'd also add to nuance this a bit is that whilst we have seen the increase somewhere in far-right support, we've seen a decline in racism, at least overt racism. So standard Eurobarometer questions, do you object to having someone of a different ethnicity as your neighbor? Those have gone down and down and down. So this isn't, as some American commentators would suggest, a simple story of European racism.
I have to tell you, reading the popular press, you would not get that impression that racism is on the way down. In fact, you'd get the contrary impression. What do you believe it to be?
Well, we throw the word racism around very generously in the city of Toronto. So let's define that term. What I mean by that is an assumption of racial inferiority and the hatred of people for that reason. If you ask me, does that explain 25% for the Front National in France? I would say absolutely not. That explains, as it's always explained, a small core of racist voters. But to understand that great success, or the great success of UKIP, you have to look at economic factors.
It's the United Kingdom Independence Party.
Exactly. There is, of course, racism, but there's also concerns about globalization. These people do very well among the have-nots of Europe, which is a function of long-term trends, deindustrialization, and short-term ones, the Euro crisis.
More on all of that as we go through the hour. Doug Saunders, how about you on the original question? How widespread, in your view, is support for these far-right parties?
To start with the optimistic side of it, Europe has just gone through the worst economic crisis that it had seen in 70 or 80 years. A devastating one that saw vast levels of youth unemployment. It saw entire economies upturned, and not a single European country saw an extreme right or otherwise anti-democratic or extremist party become the governing party. Not a single country, although I'd bracket out Hungary here, saw an extremist party become the main parliamentary opposition party either. In a number of countries, they became the third party. In countries like Germany, they basically ceased to exist. So
that's the good news.
That's the good news.
What's on the other side of the coin?
There is a cohort of Europeans who seem willing to vote for parties that are singularly devoted to the dislike of Jews, Muslims, and Roma. This group does seem to be growing. It seems to have been growing slowly since the 1960s, really. I don't think it's a reaction to any specific events, but we'll talk about why later. But I think it's alarming that nearly 1/5 of French people in the last presidential election voted to a party that's singularly devoted to the dislike of Jews, Muslims, and Roma. I think it's alarming that the United Kingdom Independence Party is becoming maybe not even a third party, but a force that could push the Conservative Party to the right. I think it's more of a worry that there's a constituency who are lost to normal politics, who are willing to fall for xenophobia or vote for a xenophobic party, and the influence that this could have over mainstream politics.
We have some numbers here to amplify on what you just said. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this up if we can. We're calling this graphic "The Far Right Marches In." In the European Union parliamentary seats, there are 751 in total. The number of seats held by far-right parties, 76, a little more than 10%. 24 seats belonging to the French National Front that Doug just referenced, 24 seats belonging to UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, also just referenced. And if we can bring up this map as well, if we look at the map of Europe and we see the areas shaded red, those are the countries where the far-right political parties have increased their support over the last several years, either a little or a lot. And the way I look at that map in Europe right now, there's a lot of red on that map. So, Randall, each European country seems to have its own far-right alternative. I guess one of the emerging consensuses here on the program is they're not all the same, but how different are they really at the end of the day?
Oh, I mean, they can be quite different. The obsession with the Roma, for example, is very much a characteristic of Jobbik in the way that it's not of UKIP. UKIP is very concerned with, or makes the basis of its support, European migration, in particular, intra-EU migration. In the case of Germany, the far right is tiny, and the alternative for Germany is really about the euro and not about Roma or migrants even. In the case of Netherlands, it's a fear, perhaps constructed fear, that immigrants or Roma Muslims will destroy liberalism. So Wilders is at least officially pro-gay and pro-Israel, which the Front National is not. So we have a very, very complex patchwork here.
Doug, I want to pick up on France, which you just talked about. How is it that in the land of, liberté, égalité, fraternité, we have a situation where if the elections were held today for president, the National Front would win? How do you explain that?
The National Front has been the contender. That is, they have 2 rounds of elections in France. And they have one where where 4 or 5 candidates are narrowed down to 2, and then they have a final vote between the 2 leading candidates. And there's been twice in the last 15 years where the National Front has actually been one of the two parties to win. If it came to an actual election, the numbers show that probably that wouldn't happen. It's simply that the UMP, the mainstream conservative party in France, does not have a candidate anybody could name, and so on. So they've filled the vacuum. On the other hand, look, the fact that, again, 1/5 of French people are willing to vote for an exclusively jingoistic party is a worry, and it shows an alienated population. It might not show anything that's terribly new, but it shows that this is a political force. It's an anti-mainstream politics force. These parties seem different in certain respects. Some of them claim to be mainly anti-European Union or anti-Muslim or anti-Jewish, but they are very similar in a certain way. First of all, they attract the same sort of people. They share a lot of views. They're all outspoken supporters of Vladimir Putin, interestingly enough. He also of them. It's a mutual thing.
That tells you something, doesn't it?
They like his approach to ethnic minorities and to nationalism. Are these people who predominantly don't like outsiders or people not like them, or are they predominantly people who are nationalists, who don't like the new borderless world of Europe, who aren't benefiting from the gains that most people have experienced from the elimination of national borders in that continent? I can't say, and I've seen these parties up close quite a bit, and I'd say it's a complex mix, and I'd like to hear from some of our academic experts on what they think.
You've anticipated my next move. I want to go to Cass right now. Cass, you're in Athens, Georgia, and I want to follow up with the UKIP party, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which has been increasing in its support over the last several months and years. For those who haven't heard about it, what are the main planks of its platform?
Well, it by and large started as a single issue party. And so it started as an anti-EU party, literally wanting to get out of the EU. And that was pretty much it. It didn't really have many other programmatic issues. And so it was by and large an anti-EU conservative party. Now, over the last couple of years, they have added new points. Most notably, they have a very strong pro-market agenda, and they have become more anti-immigration. But as Randall said, that anti-immigration is mostly oriented towards East Europeans, most notably Bulgarians and Romanians, which is in part because Britain is one of the few countries within the EU that actually allows free entrance from Bulgaria and Romania, whereas most of the other countries have capped it at a certain number. Now, there is still a lot of debate about whether or not UKIP is a far-right party. I personally think that they are moving that way, but they're still in a different category than the Front National or the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands.
Well, Cass, let me follow up with this, because one of the influences these parties can have is not only on the population, but also on the government. And I wonder how would you gauge the influence that UKIP has had on Prime Minister Cameron's Conservative Party? In other words, have they forced Cameron to move further to the right than he'd want to?
Yes, but there are two types of influence. And so the far right and parties like UKIP have a significant influence on the discourse of other parties, which is not necessarily only of the far right, of the right. Some Labour politicians have made various anti-immigrant statements over the years as well. But discourse and policy are not the same. And so what you see generally is that the discourse becomes much more, for the sake of argument, right-wing, anti-Europe, anti-immigration, but the policies don't change that much, or at least they don't change that much compared to the policies of countries where you don't have a strong anti-immigrant party. Now, in the long run, this can be highly problematic, of course, because you get a larger gap between the official discourse and the official policy, which again is something that the far right can then jump on and say, look, they're lying, right? And vote for us, and we will actually really implement that policy.
Let me get Terry on that as well. Terry, have you been able to track whether or not Prime Minister Cameron in London has changed policy as opposed to just rhetoric in order to watch out for his right-wing flank because of UKIP?
Well, he's certainly proposed policies. Whether those are actually being implemented is another situation. And I think there's certainly been a move to the right in discourses, as Cass just talked about. And there's certainly been a push to, for example, try to change the treaties at the EU level on the immigration front. And so I think in terms of policy, it's definitely been not just UKIP that has influenced David Cameron, but also elements within his own party that tend to be more anti-EU and want to see more limitations put on immigration. And so Cameron is also pursuing this at the EU level.
So that's in one country, Terry. Let me get you to follow up by telling us what kind of impact, now that they have representation in the European Parliament, what kind of impact you think these right-wing protest parties can have continent-wide?
Well, continent-wide, I think we're going to see relatively limited impact. What they will try to do is slow things down, be disruptive in the European Parliament. But I don't think that you're going to see kind of continent-wide policies that are coming from the far right. What they will influence, of course, again, is the discourses. And what's interesting, over the years, you've seen politicians like David Cameron, Angela Merkel, and the previous French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, saying things like multiculturalism has failed, and so that we need to move on to different types of policies, which has led to a shift to focusing more on immigrant integration and civic integration.
Doug, you wanted to follow on that.
You know, there's a countervailing force, and this is kind of interesting, that for the mainstream conservative parties of Europe, and I'd point especially to Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats and to David Cameron's Conservatives, their big thrust for much of the last 10 years has been to try to get votes back from the left by becoming the party of immigration and the party of multiculturalism. They might not use the word multiculturalism, but the party that people of an immigrant background, as they say in Germany, want to vote for. Merkel has tried very hard to change her policies to appeal to the sizable Turkish-German minority. Cameron did a lot of things that resemble a lot what Canadian Tories did to try to get people of religious minorities and immigrant minority backgrounds to support his party.
And they don't like multiculturalism, or they certainly don't
his party's
buy that word.
base don't like it. Yeah. They don't use that word. Britain hasn't really had a multiculturalism policy since Margaret Thatcher's days, and it was never popular. On the other hand, British people are probably more comfortable with the idea of having neighbors of other skin colors and backgrounds than other Europeans are in surveys and so on. Germans are slowly warming to the idea. So you have these mainstream conservative parties that had been trying to become the parties of diversity to get that vote from the left, realizing they have to get people of these backgrounds to vote for them. And then comes the challenge, not in Germany, but in Britain, of these anti-Europe, anti-immigration parties on the right, that are starting to steal votes, not everywhere, but in certain by-elections, certain councils, places like that. And part of the base of your party likes this. And what do? It's created a schizophrenia, or a divided mind among many of the mainstream conservative parties. I think we recognize this in Canada, where you can't decide whether you want to appeal to the people who've been voting for the left before, or for the people who've been voting for these fringe far-right parties before.
Randall, we've pointed out that these forces exist in countries all over Europe. They seem to be individually based, and I guess what I want to find out from you is whether in your analysis you're picking up any efforts to make this a more pan-European movement, as opposed to this party's in Greece, this party's in Hungary, this party's in UK, etc.
Well, there is an effort in the sense that Jean-Marie Le Pen not Jean-Marie, Miss Le Pen, thank you, Marie Le Pen.
Jean-Marie was the father.
Indeed he was, yes.
It's his daughter who's running
Lest we
now.
forget him. And Wilders attempted a coalition at the European Parliament elections. That wasn't terribly successful because they disagreed on too much. And as Terry said, the European Parliament doesn't matter. No one votes, and the European Parliament doesn't have any power anyway. It all rests in the Council and the Commission.
That's Marine Le Pen we're looking at right now, who's the current head, the daughter of the original founder and now the current head.
And part of their success is her appeal, but we could go on to that later. Where these elections matter is for, as you suggest, their effect on the national debate. And you're quite right. The UKIP has forced a dramatic change in the Conservatives' policy, but chiefly on the EU rather than on immigration.
Gotcha. Let's read this again. We quoted something from Geocurrents at the top of the program, and I want to read another excerpt from that as well. We're calling this graphic "And Hatred for All." Here's the quote. "Xenophobia is often equally harsh against other European or so-called white immigrants, particularly Albanians, Bosniaks, Greeks, Ukrainians, Bulgarians, Poles, Balts, Romanians, and Russians. In Italy, the center-right Lega Nord, the Northern League, is more xenophobic towards southern Italians than towards Muslims. The Golden Dawn of Greece is viciously hostile towards Albanians. In Switzerland, xenophobia is mostly directed against immigrants from the former Yugoslavia. Whereas most major xenophobic parties are not overtly anti-Semitic, Hungary's Jobbik is widely seen as not just anti-Zionist, but anti-Jewish and deeply anti-Ziganist, anti-Gypsy as well." Randall, again, the follow-up here. Why does this phenomenon translate into violence, it seems, particularly in Hungary and Greece, but not necessarily elsewhere?
Well, in both of those cases, I think there's two things going on. I mean, these criminal activities are being committed by individuals from the extremes who have been sort of absorbed into the far-right parties, and they've identified themselves with a fascist past in a way that North Europeans really wouldn't dream of. That's point one. Point two, you have a more extreme situation in Hungary and in Greece. You have extreme poverty in parts of eastern Hungary where this conflict is really most severe with the Roma. And as Doug was saying, the economic implosion in Greece has been absolutely massive. So it's not surprising that you're getting a different set of outcomes there than in Germany or Northern England.
We've got a documentary on right after this program tonight, 9 o'clock Eastern Time, called Judgment in Hungary. And we want to just show a little clip from that documentary. It's less than a minute long, just to sort of presage, give you a hint of what's coming up later. This is a scene where a police officer is being questioned about what he found when he arrived at the scene of murders. There are murders of Roma that are profiled in this story. We'll watch this clip, we'll come back and chat. Roll tape, please.
Mi volt ennek az első benyomása? Az volt nekem gyanús, mindenféle fai előítéletet félretéve.
A cigányokat a közösségre gondolom. Mondja már ki, hát most ezek nem tabu témák, emberek. Magyarországon élünk, laknak ilyenek, laknak olyanok.
Szóval pár évvel előtte volt, hogy Örkényen is, ahol azért elég sokan élnek, egy ilyen biztosítási csalási mizéria indult el, ott vagy 20 házat leégettek zsinórba, és szóval abból is kiindulva felmerült az, hogy esetleg a tulajdonos vagy tulajdonos próbálkozott a saját épületet felgyújtani, vagy legalábbis saját maga által követett el valamilyen cselekményt.
Judgment in Hungary immediately after this program, and we should just remind you as well that if you want to find out more about the plight of the Roma in Europe and Canada, we've got a special website dealing with this. It's at the bottom of the screen there. It's a little clunky, but hang in there. tvo.org/special/Judgment Hungary. Lots more information there about this topic we're discussing tonight and the documentary. The murders of 6 members of the Roma community highlighted in this documentary, Judgment in Hungary. Cass, let me go to you on this. How did this play out across the nation?
Well, Hungary, like the rest of Eastern Europe, particularly Central Eastern Europe, has a fairly long history of anti-Roma sentiment, as well as these kind of hate crimes, sometimes even pogroms. And when you look at pretty much all of the survey evidence, like anti-Roma prejudice is way higher than any of the other prejudices. The reason why this gets more play than, to a certain extent, a lot of similar actions that were reasonably common in countries like Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary in the 1990s is most notably the rise of Jobbik. And Jobbik has, as part of, its link to the party is the so-called Hungarian Guard, which is as you see it here, which is an unarmed paramilitary unit that has moved into eastern Hungarian towns where there are tensions with Roma and have intimidated them. And so this is all placed within that larger rise of Jobbik story, which is quite interesting because it's also used by Fidesz the mainstream right-wing party, which is often accused of being very nationalist. The whole rise of Jobbik is very much used by Fidesz to say, look, you have to by and large forgive us for all our illiberal things that we do, because we're the only ones that stand in between democracy and the rise of and the overtaking of this neo-fascist, neo-Nazi unit of Jobbik and the Hungarian Guard.
And Cass, when the hatred boils over and violence and or murder is the result, can you give us a sense about what happens to broader public support for these groups that do these things?
Well, often the groups don't really do these things. And so the vast majority of racist crime, and particularly murders, are committed by people who are not members of any political party and tend to be, if at all, associated to very small groups. In countries like Hungary, where among potential Jobbik supporters, like anti-Roma sentiments are so incredibly high, this will not have much effect on their support for Jobbik. Many will feel that it is a consequence of Roma crime, and so they will support the vigilance. So we shouldn't be overly optimistic to think that this type of crime will lead everyone to think like, oh yeah, we were wrong for the last hundreds of years in our anti-Roma sentiment.
Doug, I want to follow up with you on the public opinion angle, and I want to take you to Norway. Anders Breivik, 77 deaths. He went on that murderous rampage in 2011. Bit of an odd question, but how much sympathy for what he did you detect when you covered the story 3 years ago?
In mainstream politics, nobody would be saying this, that they supported what he did. Nobody's going to say that a mass murderer, somebody who killed 77 people in the name of anti-Muslim bigotry, essentially, is somebody they're going to support. But his ideas were drawn from the very mainstream ideas of these parties.
Ideas like?
Like the idea that there's a tide of people reproducing at a terrible pace who are going to overwhelm our civilization. The idea that the world is made into two civilizations, and so on. These are atavistic ideas that resurrected after centuries by parties on the far right, by authors on the far right, that have a constituency. And he almost called their bluff I mean, he was partly insane, partly a mad genius or something. He wrote this thousands of page long manifesto, which essentially quoted all of the leaders and intellectual figures from these extreme right parties across Europe to justify his crime, and they have to answer for that a little bit. I wouldn't argue that Geert Wilders or Marine Le Pen could be blamed for causing this mass murder, but the idea that somebody could take their published ideas and use it as a justification for an act like this became an issue. I did find Norwegian figures on the far right, including people who had newspaper columns and so on, who were willing to say, oh, I read his manifesto and I agreed with it completely. Mind you, there were writers in the United States who said that his manifesto was just fine if only he hadn't gone and killed teenagers based on it. So it really exposed the fact that ideas that should have vanished from Europe after the Second World War still are hanging in the air.
Let me pick up on that and go to Terry on this. There are certainly people who are alive and living in Greece today who have firsthand memories of the Germans, Nazi Germany, walking into Greece and occupying that country for 4 years during World War II. How is it possible then that Golden Dawn, which is the far-right movement in Greece, garners any support at all given its neo-Nazi tendencies?
Well, you have to keep in mind that Greece has gone through several major socioeconomic changes, including a major shift to democracy, and also joining the European Union, and then, of course, the economic downturn that has hit Greece perhaps harder than just about any other country. You've got very high levels of unemployment, and you've got people who have been concerned about the immigration issue for many years. Keep in mind that Greece is on the front lines of immigration. They have a lot of people coming in over the border from Turkey, and because of the EU's immigration policies, they are basically required as the first place that these people come to deal with the detention, and unfortunately many of them are being detained, as well as just processing a lot of refugees and people. And so people are, they're unemployed, they have concerns, they, especially young people. And so this ideology that is being put forward is appealing to people who have serious concerns about what is happening economically as well as socially in their country.
Randall?
No, just to say, in the case of Greece, like all countries, one has to answer these questions historically. And let's not forget the Greek Civil War. For many Greeks, the true villains were not, in fact, the National Socialists, but the Communists who murdered them during the Civil War. So that there is a small but significant extreme right in Greece isn't surprising given that history and that tie to the old monarchist right.
Well, Terry, let me go back to you and stay with World War II because, interestingly enough, the one country where you don't hear that there is a significant ultra-right-wing force at play is the country that was responsible for the worst evil probably in the history of the world, which is Germany. Why is that the case?
Well, Germany has done a good job of, first of all, taking responsibility for what happened after World War II in terms of teaching young people, making sure young people are independent-minded, and so on. And so I think what we're seeing in Germany also, though, is a political situation that makes it very difficult for far-right parties to gain votes, particularly at the national level. You have Germany designed its electoral system to keep small extreme parties out. And so you have a 5% hurdle that parties have to meet in order to win seats in the national parliament. You have other factors, for example, the NPD, which was winning seats at the state level for a while, or the local level, has been under constant supervision, not supervision, but investigation, because any party that is considered to be anti-constitutional can be banned. And so also there's just a lack of appeal in a country that is actually doing better economically than most other European countries.
Doug?
I think that's an important factor. Countries where things seem to be going well in a positive direction don't tend to have these parties emerge from the woodwork. Germany, the neo-Nazi right is a criminal problem, not a political problem. They gain a few votes in municipal elections in a few former regions of the former East Germany, but they've never risen above that. And in fact, their numbers have been falling. Germany, of course, is the economic heart of Europe. It's now become the world's largest exporter and so on. Ukraine had an election this past weekend in which the extreme right parties, which we'd been worried about during the protests last year, they seem to have been a force, basically nixed out. Neither of the ultranationalist or extreme right parties managed to pass the 5% vote threshold. They were in the single digits, and people voted overwhelmingly for pro-European parties.
You're encouraged by that, I presume.
A sense of, it's very nice to see Europeans not making those sort of Ukrainians not making those sort of choices. So, is this a reaction to economics? Well, no, not completely either. That's the problem, is there have been other times, and I should say it's also not a reaction to anything having to do with immigration or refugees. There have been times when there have been many more refugees in Europe, like in the early 1990s, much more immigration, and you haven't seen this. So it's a little bit glib to try to attach it directly to economic factors. I mean, really, the awfulness of the economic downturn, we should be celebrating the fact that so few far-right parties did well.
Randall.
I was going to follow exactly that. I mean, and the Ukrainian economy is imploding, of course. And on the other hand, the far right's actually doing quite well in Norway and Denmark, which are very extremely wealthy countries, wealthier than Germany. I think what we can't forget here is where the far right does well is where it pitches its appeal in terms of concerns that go to the core of national values. So in Denmark, the far right has convinced people that immigrants threaten the welfare state. In the Netherlands, immigrants threaten liberal values, because all Muslims, don't we know, are homophobic. In the case of France, globalization is threatening the core of France, and Muslims are threatening secularism. When you can give it that sort of hook, then support for the far right will increase incredibly.
What do the facts say about all of those things you just mentioned?
Well, it's complicated, in fact. In the case of the Netherlands, opinion polls do show that Muslims hold more conservative attitudes. It's ridiculous to say that all are homophobic, but they do hold more conservative attitudes on gay marriage, on premarital sex, than secular Dutch or Christian Dutch. In the case of Northern Europe, there's a lot of evidence that immigrants are being incorporated into welfare rather than into work, and unemployment among immigrants is extremely high compared to North America. And so, we tend to go to the extremes in this debate. There's a mushy middle, and some of the arguments actually have a grain of truth to them, as uncomfortable as that conclusion is.
Speaking of uncomfortable, I want to ask an uncomfortable question here to our guests in the deep south of the United States, because I want to ask about, and I preface the question by saying, all of my interactions with people in the Tea Party movement, these folks seem, in my experience anyway, to be just very deeply concerned about government not getting too big, about taxes not getting out of hand, about the debt and deficit not getting out of control. Having said that, Terry, to you first, and then Cass, I want to hear you as well. Do you think there are any relevant comparisons here between what we've been talking about in Europe and the Tea Party movement in the United States? Terry?
Well, it's interesting. I'm starting to look at that question myself. And I think one of the things that is common is this idea of globalization having an impact on a certain group of people. If we look at, in my research back in the late 90s on the far right, you saw that there's mostly, unemployed or men who have been, less employed in lower positions than they might have had in the past, and also who white males who might feel that their position is being threatened by both in terms of employment but also culturally. So I think there is this sense that here in Texas, that we have Spanish speakers, particularly people from Mexico, who may be actually the real fact is we are a minority state, and that the Spanish-speaking population, as well as the people coming from Mexico, Central America, and other parts of Latin America, are basically their numbers are growing faster than the white and even the black population.
Cass, how about you on the Tea Party angle?
Well, it's first of all, of course, it's an incredibly diverse movement where there's a big difference between what they call the astroturf part, which is mostly controlled by the GOP, and the grassroots movement, which vary from pretty much libertarian groups to white supremacist groups. I've been to various Tea Party meetings in Indiana when I lived there, and although you do see all the big government anti-big government signs, you also always saw birther kind of signs which claim that Barack Obama is not really an American, always anti-immigration signs, anti-abortion signs, Obama, Muslim socialist, that kind of thing. I think overall, because of the way the political system works, you don't see the far right as clearly in the US, but there's a lot of sympathy for the far right, and there's growing sympathy for the far right among the mainstream right here in the US. And as an example, Geert Wilders is very popular here in the US, and was last week again in the US, where he had lunch with Senator Michelle Bachmann at Capitol Hill, or representative.
Yeah, she's not a senator. And there's a picture of him. How long were you living in Europe for?
Greater part of a decade.
Most part of a decade, okay. Now that you're back and looking at Tea Party stuff in the United States, does it seem to you that Preston Manning used to have this line, that a bright light will attract its share of moths? Is this a movement, in your view, mostly of regular Americans who want to just sort of have a view about government, or are there too many moths in this movement?
There is a subset of the Tea Party and of the Republican Party, which is of course intertwined, which believes a conspiracy theory about Muslim immigrants in the United States being poised to take over the country. It's very similar to the conspiracy theory about Catholics from the 1950s. Which is particularly weird in the United States, where first of all, Muslims are a tiny and kind of irrelevant group. They're also extremely wealthy, middle class, and they have the highest university education rate, higher than any Christian population anyways.
Randall.
I simply want to say earlier that we have this in the United States. Terry alluded to that to make it but to make it explicit, the far right is contained within the Republican Party. You have a much looser party structure in the United States, the loosest in the world. So these incredibly diverse movements, you can have East Coast Republicans and far-right Southern Republicans in the same party. In Europe, they form separate parties, and it looks more dangerous as a result, but it's not fundamentally different.
Let me follow up on the Muslim angle, and Cass, I'll go to you first on this one. In your native Netherlands, the far right has, from what I understand, focused its hate in particular on the Muslim community. How come?
Well, I think there are various reasons for this. I mean, first of all, the Netherlands, a bit like Germany, was most affected probably by the Holocaust trauma and reproduced that over and over again to the extent that pretty much until 9/11, ethnic prejudice or even nationalism was considered negative. And by and large, whenever you said anything nationalist, like people would say, "Oh, you're a neo-Nazi," and so it was very hard to come up with to openly state prejudices, except about Germans. That was always acceptable for the Dutch. But then through 9/11, you could actually what makes Islamophobia so popular and to a certain extent also so mainstream is you have two different discourses. One is the classic prejudiced ethnic nationalist. The other one is the liberal democratic. And so in the Netherlands, that one was acceptable. Like you can oppose Muslims on the basis of like a defense of gay rights, a defense of gender equality. Now, most of the people who are Islamophobic believe in these things in the Netherlands, but they also believe in some other ethnic prejudices towards Muslims, but they don't have to make those because you can hide behind the defense of liberal democracy and a fear of terrorism.
Doug.
I think this is an important factor, is that when you look at the voting numbers for these parties, we shouldn't rush to the conclusion that everybody who's voting for them is a racist, xenophobic, intolerant person, and so on. There are a lot of mainstream voters who were curious about their new neighbors who wore headscarves or had beards and so on, whose arrival, not in record numbers, but in some visible numbers, coincided with the rise of international terrorism in the news, and wanted answers to this. And the mainstream parties
maybe didn't have
tended to shy away from it. It wasn't a matter of discussion. You had an easy narrative offered by the fringe parties. You had an easy narrative about the Roma, who in many European countries are in a position similar to First Nations in Canada, for example. They're formerly tribal or nomadic people who they're not immigrants. They've lived in parallel for throughout history, but who have an awkward relationship that's often been tinged with racism and so on. You have and many of these countries during communism simply tried to bury this problem by essentially interring people away. And people became asking questions about how do we deal with these marginalized people who tend to live impoverished lives and feel like a threat to us on the edge of our cities and so on. These parties offered an easy answer when the mainstream parties offered no answer.
Well,
nobody had the courage to stand up and say, no, this is all mythology. We should face this in a mature way.
I do want to, and again with some trepidation, ask Cass a follow-up question on this because Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton are two really good examples of men who did really well and have a hard time defending things that their brothers did. Cass, you want to tell us who your brother is?
Not particularly, no.
You're going to forgive the follow-up, but I mean, he is one of the leaders of the far-right movement in your native country, yes?
He was.
He was. And what's his situation now?
It's irrelevant.
Okay. Are you on speaking terms with him?
I haven't. This is ridiculous to ask.
Okay. In which case, we shall leave it. Randall, let's move on here.
Yeah.
Let us remember, I want to go back to Germany. The Holocaust was Nazi Germany's attempt to extinguish the Jewish presence in Europe. Yeah. 6 million Jews were exterminated. It bears repeating because there are a lot of people who either don't know the history or who deny the history. How is it that there is still anti-Semitism in Europe in spite of all of that?
Well, there isn't anti-Semitism in Germany, or basically none. And that's because, for reasons we talked about, Germany has learned the lessons of its history in a way that these other countries have not necessarily. I can't give a very good answer except to say that anti-Semitism is a terribly powerful poison that continues to have appeal not simply in Europe, but indeed around the world. You can find anti-Semites in Toronto, in New York City, and in Los Angeles. It's one of these hatreds that's proved extremely hard to kill. And as you said, even in Europe, the Holocaust hasn't done it. And with every year that passes, one forgets the Holocaust, and one finds a new narrative. I mean, Palestine has given a new, and there are people who are genuinely concerned about Palestine, and I don't criticize them for a moment, but Palestine has given some forms of anti-Semitism a new respectability. You give it a new hook and you pursue an old idea.
Terry, there's a decent-sized Jewish community in Toronto, and as a result, there's anti-Semitism in Toronto. You hear about it in the news from time to time, and there are certainly young Jewish kids, for example, at universities who say it's a problem. How about in Texas? There are not as many Jews in Texas as there are in Toronto. What's the anti-Semitism situation like as far as you can tell?
Well, it's really not on the radar screen at all. We have a Jewish speaker of the State House, and occasionally you'll hear mention of that. But other than that, there really isn't much discussion of anti-Semitism. We've got plenty of other issues, as you can imagine, here in Texas that hit the headlines.
Okay. Doug, in your experience, are minorities speaking up about this?
This is a time when discrimination against religious minorities is something that's becoming more visible after a period when either it was lower or we didn't talk about it very much more. It varies from country to country. In Europe, especially, you have some countries like Hungary and Poland where more than 50% of the population are willing to express great intolerance, not great, but dislike of Jews, let's say. You have countries along the Atlantic coast of Europe where it's in single digits or 10 or 15%, still alarming, but nowhere near as high. I don't want to generalize, but often the countries that have the smallest populations of these minorities have the strongest voices of anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim intolerance, anti-Roma intolerance.
How does that make any sense at all?
There's an old expression, anti-Semitism without Jews, which I think was often used to describe some of the countries of Eastern Europe, that it essentially expelled or killed their entire Jewish population. The current government of Poland is a party that's very tolerant and okay, but the leading opposition party, the time I've spent among its ranks, there is a surprising willingness to say things that sound like anti-Semitism and to accept other people's saying things like that. In Hungary, the Jobbik party, which is an opposition party that we've discussed here, is often overtly anti-Semitic, anti-Roma, anti-Muslim. But the governing Fidesz party, although officially not, a surprising number of its MPs, when I've sat down and talked to them and its supporters and major figures, are quite willing to be at least tolerant of other people's anti-Semitism, anti-Roma, anti-Muslim views, and so on, even though Hungary and Poland have unmeasurably small numbers of Jews, virtually very, very few Muslims. Roma populations are another matter.
I've actually seen, Randall, stories in the papers, for example, about an increased awareness and or interest of the Jewish history and community, negligible though it may be, in Poland these days.
In Poland, absolutely, and in Germany to a superlative degree. But I'd like to come back to something that was said before. Another element in this that we can't forget is that Muslim immigration has, uncomfortable fact, imported anti-Semitism to Europe. Anti-Semitism in Western Europe, in Germany and France, is emerging disproportionately out of Muslim communities. You see that in opinion polls. And last summer in Berlin, when people went on the street and said, "Jew, Jew, you cowardly pig, come out into the street," those were Arab or Turkish Germans. In Paris, when there was basically a mini pogrom in a Jewish neighborhood, those were North Africans. And the dynamic behind that needs to be explored. One element of it is this: when one thinks of oneself as a victim, it's very hard to recognize one's illiberalism.
Can I just ask the control room, I did see the Skype bail out there. Has Cass left us? He has left us. Okay. We will We will move on then. All right. Well, the funny thing is, I have seen him quoted as having said, "I am tolerant of my brother's intolerance." And clearly I wanted to explore an angle here about whether or not this issue divides families, as it clearly has his, but I'm sorry he's not here to have that conversation. In any event, I'm going to Terry with this next one. Terry, I'm going to try my French here, which is not great, but I'm going to give it a shot because you know the book I want to talk about. Le suicide français, c'est 40 années qui ont défait la France. The French suicide, the 40 years that defeated France. It's a bestseller in France. Terry, what's this book about?
Well, it's basically about the fact that France has been committing suicide, as it has said, by bringing in immigrants and he argues basically that the left and others have been undermining French culture and French homogeneity by allowing immigrants to come in to change the culture, to basically make France weaker.
And who is the author of the book?
Eric Zemmour is he's often seen as being affiliated with the far right in France. He is a journalist and commentator on French networks, and he has been very controversial in his outspokenness against Muslims and others and their impact on France and France's culture.
What's his background?
And his background is that he is actually of immigrant background and Jewish background.
He's Jewish from Algeria, is he not?
Yes, indeed.
How does a Jew from Algeria write a book about this?
Well, you have to keep in mind that he is so in France, because of the Republican ideology and so on, which he is very much a proponent of, he is very much sees himself as very, very French, meaning that he is a good example of what it means to be French in terms of taking on certain ideologies about what it means, liberté, égalité, fraternity, but in the sense that you are somebody who is supportive of France as a major leader in the culture and politics of the world.
All right, with just a few minutes to go here, let's try one more thing. Actually, let me plug the website one more time because we've got the documentary coming on shortly thereafter. Have you got the thing up there? Let's put the website up. There it is right now. tvo.org/special/judgment history. You can find out more about the plight of the Roma in Canada, around the world. We have a documentary coming up, Judgment in Hungary, right after we're off the air at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Randall, talk to us about the efforts that are underway to integrate the Roma community into the broader European family of nations. How's that going?
Well, it's, again, a mixed picture. Spain, for example, has done quite a good job of integrating its Roma community, and there's much less prejudice there and much more work for Roma. In Eastern Europe, in places like Hungary, it's a much less positive picture. The EU put a lot of pressure in the run-up to accession, to joining the EU on these countries. The problem is once they're in the, once a country is part of the EU, that pressure is by definition gone. There's funds available, there are programs the Hungarian government is implementing. It's not doing nothing, it has implemented some measures, but there's a lot of work to do. And some of these communities do live lifestyles which are very hard to reconcile with modernity. In a sense, as Doug said, it's the First Nations debate we're having in this country.
Well, let me pick up on that, Doug. I have heard it said, you can tell me if you agree, that the Roma don't want to integrate into mainstream society in a world that is becoming increasingly integrated, and therefore, that's part of the problem. Is that true?
I don't think the phrase "don't want to" would be the expression.
What's a better expression?
They are in a position where the question of integration isn't really the question at hand here. These are not immigrants. This is a parallel population with its own traditions and history who've been terribly marginalized, driven into poverty, and who have to have a relationship with other European communities that works. A lot of it looks like integration when it works. The Roma in Spain are not assimilated. They're not Spanish, but they are the largest Roma community of any Western European country, and they have a very comfortable coexistence, and so on. There needs to be a settlement, much as there has been with First Nations. This is not like immigrants, where things are working okay in Europe, where you have most immigrant communities are doing what immigrant communities have done in North America and Europe, becoming generation after generation much more like the people around them. It's a separate problem.
Terry, do you have a view on what would have to change in order for the Roma to be more embraced by the countries that they currently live in?
Well, I agree with Doug. I think it really has to focus on accepting the Roma for who they and what they are, and trying to work within that framework. And there are a lot of efforts in the EU. The EU has really taken a lead role in trying to work with the member countries in incorporating the Roma in a way that still allows them to maintain at least some parts of their culture.
Terry, can I follow with this? I mean, one of the things we've obviously been trying to explore tonight is whether what we're seeing right now, the rise of far-right parties in Europe, presages a hellacious, violent future akin to what we saw 70 years ago in Europe, which eventually turned into something hateful and evil and appalling and deadly. And I guess I want to get a better understanding before we close the book on this discussion tonight, whether you see any similarities between the Europe of today and, say, the Eastern Europe of 1938-39.
And I'd have to say absolutely not. We don't see, as we've said earlier in the program, we don't see any far-right parties that have been able to go into power in any of these countries. And I think Doug is right. I think we're, in a sense, breathing a sigh of relief that we haven't seen the far-right doing even better than they have in the last few years, given the economic situation in Europe. And frankly, we look at some of the issues of violence. We have a lot of these issues still here in the United States. We can look at the situation in Ferguson. I, as a mother of 2 black boys, have to worry about my children here. I think a lot of these issues are just general issues that we have to grapple with when we're dealing with clashes of culture, or not even clashes, just trying to live along together.
And yet, Randall, should we expect, with youth unemployment in Europe being, in some countries 50, 60, 70%, it's off the charts, should we expect young, unemployed men, for the most part, to take out their frustrations and their anxieties about their predicament on the most helpless among us?
Well, I mean, we shouldn't expect it and we shouldn't tolerate it, but it might well happen. And if I understand the Birdville question, this is not the 1930s, this is not 1938, this is not 1933. But if the economic crisis continues and places countries like Greece under such enormous pressure, we're going to continue to have very, very serious social problems, continued anti-Islamic, anti-immigrant sentiment, and at least localized violence. For the moment, I don't think it's system threatening. The countries we need to watch, though, I think, are Hungary, which is veering ever further to the right, and outside Europe, of course, Russia. If I were worried about 2 countries, it would be those 2.
I literally got 30 seconds. Can you add to that in 30?
I think we can celebrate this fact. We need to watch out for a narrative which makes Europeans believe that they are uni-ethnic places. Europe has always been multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and it's only since the Second World War that this idea of my people has come to dominate. I'm hoping the mainstream parties of Europe can counter this narrative.
That is an optimistic note to leave it on, which we often don't do on this program, so we're happy to leave it on an optimistic note tonight. Thanks all for participating in our discussion tonight, both in the United States and here in our studio on Leaside. Appreciate your time, everybody.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.